under and brings clarity to who we are. I am using PowerPoint this morning, so hopefully this works. It's new for me. I've never used PowerPoint before, but I thought I would try it this morning. There's just a number of different points, main points that I want to bring up. So bear with me. It's different. I do want to try to go through this as smoothly as possible and also in a way that can be a blessing to you all and that can bring forth the Word of God in a way that's good and right. I'd like to begin this morning with a story. And maybe before I begin, for the sake of those that are visitors this morning, I've been going through the book of Ephesians, and we're coming down the home stretch. And this morning's message is from Ephesians 6, from about 10 to verse 18. And so we want to look at that, and that is entitled, The message is entitled, The Armor of God, because it talks about those verses there where it describes how we are to put on the full armor of God. And so now for the story, and as an introduction to this message, I want to tell you one of my favorite Bible stories. I know I've said it here before, but I'm going to tell it to you again. But 2 Kings chapter 6, there's actually several stories in this chapter. But I want to start in, the story begins where I want to start in about verse 8. The country of Syria was at war against Israel again. This story begins with telling us how a Syrian general, he'd have these strategic planning sessions with his army and with his servants. And as all good generals do, he planned out his next move and he placed his army strategically. Ironically, the Israelite army was always a step ahead of him. They were always a step ahead of the Syrians, and they did exactly what it took to counter the moves of this Syrian general. It tells that it's happened not only once or twice, but numerous times. And so finally this Syrian general, he calls another meeting and says, what's going on here? I can just imagine that in his mind he was thinking, we've got a leaker. We've got someone that's working for the Israelite army. We've got a spy here. Who's leaking information? Who's betraying our moves? It says here, who is for the king of Israel? I find it fascinating that one of the servants knew what was going on. Now, he wasn't the leaker, but somehow in his mind, he knew what's going on. Could it be that he heard the stories of the prophet Israel? And if I'm not mistaken, this would have all been in several years' time period here. But could it be he heard the stories of Naaman and how Naaman was healed? It's really fascinating to think about where Naaman may have fit into this picture. It doesn't tell us. The Bible isn't clear, but I have a feeling this is probably another group or another general. I don't know. But could it be that this person knew about Naaman? I believe that probably this story got blown up pretty well, and a lot of people would have known the story of Naaman and how he was healed. Remember, Naaman was a Syrian captain. You would think that this would have been reason enough for some people to believe, maybe even sympathize with Israel, and even want to serve this God that could heal somebody just by telling him, how Naaman was healed just by dipping 7 times in the Jordan was obviously a miracle. I don't think other people went to Jordan just to see if dipping 7 times would heal them. Maybe a few did. But for the most part, it was obvious that this was a miracle from God. So could it be that this servant knew about this? I'm going to read verse 12 where it says, And one of his servants said, None, my lord. Remember, he's responding to this general. O king, but Elisha the prophet that is in Israel telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. So he's basically telling the king, you know what, this Elisha, it's just like he knows what you're thinking. He knows what's going on in your bedroom, and he goes and tells the king of Israel what's going on. The king of Syria obviously believed this, and he sends spies out to do what? To find Elisha. They find Elisha in the city of Dothan. And it says that the king sends horses and chariots and a great host to surround the city for one man. And they did it at night. Apparently he decided that he's going to get around this one way. And so they moved this whole army in and surrounded the city at night. Which takes us then to Elisha's side of the story. And so, early the next morning, Elisha's servant wakes up. He realizes what is going on and is understandably alarmed. Gets up in the morning and goes outside and realizes that they are surrounded by an army of people. Not only was there soldiers, but it says there was horses and chariots, and so it seems like they brought in the whole team, the whole cavalry, and they're out to get him. The servant says, "What shall we do?" He's alarmed. Elisha comforts the servant by saying, "They that be with us are more than they that are with them." And can you imagine the servant thinking, seriously? How can this be? There's only you and I and maybe a few people in the city that would stand with us. But Elisha takes it a step further and prays that God would open the eyes of his servant. And he realized that his servant wasn't as aware of what kind of a battle this is and of what's going on. And so he prays that God would open the eyes of the servant. The Bible tells us that the Lord opened the eyes of this young man, and when he could really see what was going on, he saw the hosts of heaven. He saw the horses and the chariots. And I think it says that the mountains were full of them. Maybe I should just read it. "Behold, an host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots, and his servant said unto him, Alas, my master, how shall we do?" It's almost like, now what do we do with this, with these resources? The story goes on to tell us how Elisha led these men. Well, Elisha prayed again, and these men were struck with blindness. And Elisha led these men into Samaria before the king. And there, the king, again, if I'm not mistaken, he asked, "Well, what am I going to do?" And they ended up feeding this whole army and sending them on their way. It tells us that this king didn't come back to besiege Samaria again. I don't think it was the end of the conflicts that the children of Israel had as a whole, but he didn't come back to Samaria again. It certainly passes for what I would call a coals of fire story, and it gives us an example of how God will fight for his people. I like to draw two lessons from this story. The first one is God's people can know the tactics of the enemy, and I see the font. I believe that as God's people, when we seek, we can know at least somewhat the tactics of the enemy. The second thing is that God's people are surrounded by the armies of God. There is no lack of resources. God's people are surrounded by the armies.